All right, so welcome to Serving Participants Who Are Deaf or Hard of Hearing Best Practices. Today we have Elise Na, who's a Regional Area Manager, and Jada Johnson, who's our pre-ETS rep from Voc Rehab Services to present today, and we are just thrilled that they're there. So I will pass it off to them to begin the training.
Hello, everyone. It's great to see everyone that was able to join today. And Jada and I are both thrilled to be able to present on this topic because it's an important topic because you never know when you're going to work with a student or a participant who is deaf or hard of hearing, either now or in the future. And first, before we begin, we'd like to just identify ourselves. My name is Elise Na, and I am the Rehabilitation Area Manager, the Deaf Hard of Hearing Services, and we are in St. Paul. And obviously, I'm not in the office; I'm projecting from home. And we work within the 7-county metro, providing services. I am a white woman, with brown glasses, and I have a short bob as a hairstyle. I'm not sure what color you would say, maybe light brown, or maybe a little bit of blonde mixed in there. And I'm currently wearing a black long sleeve t-shirt, and I also have silver earrings on and a beaded bracelet on my right hand. So I'm going to turn it over to Jada to introduce herself.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Jada Johnson. I am the pre-ETS rehab representative on the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services team located in the St. Paul office with Elise. I am a Black woman. I have braids, kind of wavy at the bottom. I'm wearing a green shirt. My background is white walls with a closed door, and my pronouns are she, her.
This is Elise. Excellent. And I should say my pronouns. My pronouns are also she, her, and hers. And the background of the room that I am is blue, and there is a framed picture behind me. So as far as my role as the Rehabilitation Area Manager for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing team, and I'll go a little bit briefly into some of my background. I am from a hearing family. I'm the only deaf child in a hearing family. And I started when I was 3 learning a oral approach to school, mostly like speech and lip reading. And that was my education up until college. I went to Gallaudet University for my undergrad when I was 22 years old. And that's just a little bit of my educational background and who I am. And I'll pass it back over to Jada to do the same.
Great, thanks, Elise. I was born hearing, and when I was 2 years old, I was sick, lost my hearing then. I went to a mainstream elementary school with speech therapy. In high school, I also went to a mainstream school working through interpreters and also went through speech therapy. Once I graduated, I went to Gallaudet University, which was completely in American Sign Language, which was my first experience with culture shock. Everyone was signing, no one was speaking, no interpreters, so that was a big change for me. And here I am today.
And this is Elise. So before we begin today, I thought I'd throw out a fun fact. So everybody knows that the Olympics are currently happening, and I know a lot of folks are enjoying watching the Olympics in Japan this year, in Tokyo. And I'm not sure, Jada, do you know what is the sign for Tokyo? Is it this?
It might be this.
Okay. But did you know that we have somebody in the Olympics that is deaf right now? And that person is David Smith. And he's on the men's volleyball team, a deaf Olympian from the United States. So that's something to celebrate. So I always like to follow the Olympics and especially any sort of event that's going on worldwide if there are deaf or hard of hearing participants, because it's just a way that we can support our community worldwide. So for today's training, our objectives, we have a few I'd like to share with you. So we will share some just important factors to think about before providing services to students who are deaf and hard of hearing. And we'll also identify communication modes and accommodations, and also some assistive technology out there for working with students who are deaf and hard of hearing. We'll also share some research and successful approaches to working with deaf and hard of hearing students, and we'll share some resources, local resources here in Minnesota, or resources online, or resources for learning more about American Sign Language. So I'm excited to begin. However, before we start, I would like to open it up with a poll, just to kind of get an idea of who the audience is. Since this is a statewide training available, I would just like to open it up with a poll. And Anne, if you could post that, that would be great. Okay, I'm just watching the responses as they come in. Okay, we've got another minute to go. Okay, it's looking about 70% so far of yes, have received a referral. Almost 30% no. How long, Anne, how long is the poll running for? Or am I able to stop it myself? Oh, okay, great. So it looks like about 70% of you all have received a referral for a student who's deaf or hard of hearing. About 27% have not, and 4% say they are not sure. That's interesting. That 4% not sure, I'm wondering if it's because maybe the student themselves is not identifying as deaf or hard of hearing, and maybe after interacting with them, you maybe suspect maybe they are. I don't know. That's interesting, that 4% of people being not sure. I'm also checking in with the chat here. Somebody said, well, I have not received a referral. One of my schools is actively posting seeing an ASL interpreter for high school. Yes, I see that a lot. A lot of job postings right now statewide looking for interpreters, and also for teachers of the deaf and hard of hearing too. Jada, would you like to add anything before we go on?
No, not right now. I think you've covered it.
Okay, great. So this leads to nicely what I would like to talk about next. You know, hearing loss is more common than you would think, especially mild hearing loss. Mostly people who identify as hard of hearing. They may have a primary disability that is something else, whereas their secondary disability would be deaf and hard of hearing. So thank you all for participating in that poll. So of course, that leads us to the numbers. We have to share the numbers. So currently, there are 732 students statewide who identify as deaf and hard of hearing. And those are ones that have a 504 or an IEP plan. So you can imagine that, that's a high number. It's a lot who are self-identifying. Now, 90% are in mainstream educational settings. That means they are not currently attending the deaf school in Faribault, Minnesota, or MDS, Metro Deaf School in St. Paul. When I think back to the 1960s, we used to be called that the rubella year. We had the rubella epidemic, and a lot of results of having rubella was deafness. And now I'd say there's been a shift. There's many people and students who are deaf and plus another disability. And we're seeing, I wonder, because we're just seeing a lot of babies born prematurely. That might be a cause of deafness. There might be interactions of medications that may cause hearing loss. Or a lot of these students are recognized, or they're identified much earlier as having hearing loss. Next slide, please. So there's 48 million people in America that are kind of identify as having a hearing loss. And it's more men than women. And the numbers in youth of those identifying with the hearing loss are rising. And I'd like to ask the audience why you think that is, if you could just respond in the chat. Somebody quote said environmental, use of headphones, noise, screening happening, newborn screening, earbuds, headphones. Yes, I would say definitely those are contributing factors to seeing that number rise, because it just seems we're just more connected to devices like through earbuds or headphones, and that can just cause hearing damage. And so I wonder what's going to happen in the future as technology and youth are more and more intertwined. We'll just have to see.
This is Jade. I'd like to add there are just a few more things that coming in through the chat. Some individuals, I just wanted to stay still. Some individuals are saying that people might be more comfortable disclosing with hearing loss because there are better services available.
Right, yes. And somebody asked, are there reasons that students who are deaf and hard of hearing are overlooked in the referral process? And my answer to that is yes, there are reasons. It can be challenging. Well, generally speaking, for any student to go through the application process for services can be challenging. And then for deaf and hard of hearing students, it could be them feeling, well, I don't need services, I'm fine. It could be they're not yet identifying as a person with hearing loss because of the stigma that can be associated with that, especially that can feel more heightened for young people. You know, I remember wanting to grow my hair long so I could hide my hearing aids because I was embarrassed. You know, I was a kid with glasses and braces and hearing aids. You know, that can be really rough for a young person. Today, I think it's a little bit better. That stigma is not as intense, but, you know, it just kind of depends on the person and individuals. I just think students just kind of, it's hard, it's a challenge to get them to follow through with the application process sometimes. Like maybe they have itinerant teachers that they only see once a week, or maybe once every 2 weeks. Maybe they're not receiving that consistency of support of services. Whereas other students who maybe have a teacher that they see every day is able to kind of make sure that that student follows through with what they need to do for the application process. So that's just some ideas of why they may be overlooked more than others. Jada, did you want to add?
Absolutely. I would like to add, I completely agree with that. There are also some schools with transition students, deaf and hard of hearing students who are very familiar with the VRS process, whereas some schools don't understand that those services are available. So luckily my school has already been assigned to VRS and they're familiar with those services and they start that early on in the high school journey. So I think it also depends on the environment they're in.
This is Elise. Some special ed teachers maybe don't have, or maybe just don't kind of think about deaf and hard of hearing students right away as potential candidates to refer to VR. You know, I think it's changing. The Minnesota Department of Education is really doing a great job of trying to educate all instructors of the importance of referring those students if needed. So 48 million people in the US identify as having hearing loss. 1 in 5 Minnesotans are deaf or hard of hearing, and that's equitable to about 20% of the population. And current data does show that this year VR has served 445 of these individuals, 150 of those being transition aged youth. So 257 are ages 14 to 21 that have been served. So about half. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to make sure in this presentation with myself and Jada that I also wanted to spotlight our phenomenal team that works with us as well at the St. Paul Deaf and Hard of Hearing team. We have many talented folks that are available to you for consulting if needed. We have 5 counselors. 4 of the 5 cover the metro area, and one of our counselors is responsible for the Mankato and Rochester and Faribault, the southern region. That counselor is in our team. We have Jada, who is our pre-ETS rehab rep. We have 1 placement coordinator. We have 2 occupational communication specialists, OCSs. And that might be a new term, a new acronym for you. And I can get into that a little bit later on. But our OCSs do a myriad of just crucial services. They offer consultation and they work in the metro area currently. I wish we were able to get them out statewide. We just have to kind of abide by the limits that are set on us by our numbers. But they are there to consult or to provide resources when needed. And they work with people one-on-one and really take the time to kind of work with people one-on-one. And again, currently just in the metro area. So furthermore, we have 2 VR techs who are phenomenal with purchasing the equipment that we need. I mean, to purchase hearing aids can be an incredibly complicated process. To navigate college systems, Gallaudet or RIT or any university has their own system that our VR techs get to know very well in order to do that. We have 1 OAS, an office administrator. She's been with us so long. She is the heart of our team. And she's just phenomenal. She just knows exactly where everything is. And when we ask for what we need, she's able to let us know immediately. So I just think it's important to recognize that our team is a group of phenomenal people and all know and use American Sign Language and also other communication modes as well. And please, I just want to emphasize, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to any one of our team. Next slide, please. So on this next slide, I have a quote that just really hits home. The quote is, "Blindness cuts us off from things, but deafness cuts us off from people." And that's because of the communication part. People were meant to communicate and connect with each other. And deafness is something that can cut off communication. And I think it's important for people to understand that deaf people often feel like they are charged with making communication happen with other people, whether it's through trying to lip read or communicate by writing back and forth. It's a challenge to get the information that we need. And I don't think that most people don't often think about just how much communication is important to us and how much we try to make communication happen. And when people aren't able to meet us where we're at, it's even more of a challenge. And it's just important for our staff who use American Sign Language or any other communication mode to feel as most comfortable as possible when communicating with people. Next slide, please. So next I want to talk about barriers, and specifically communication barriers or cultural barriers. For example, right now, COVID, wearing masks is actually a barrier for deaf and hard of hearing people. Mm. And communicating with somebody with a mask on, it's hard for a person to know, like, well, are we getting me? It's hard to get that kind of that feedback. Mm. And just the distance too of this time of a barrier, not being able to see our students more often. And sometimes it's hard to just remember what were we working on? It's been so long. So that's been a barrier as well. And our job within this field is to break down barriers. There's technology barriers, especially if you're showing a video that doesn't have captions. How does the deaf and hard student supposed to get anything from that video without having access to that communication? Mhm. And you can ask, well, what would one accommodation would be to ask for an ASL sign language interpreter to interpret that video so that student has access. That's a way to break down barriers. Right now, especially with COVID, we're using Zoom, and Zoom is a wonderful platform. There's been a lot of great technologies, but it's 2D, it's not 3D. When it's 2D, you aren't able to see the full picture, the body language, which can be a challenge for deaf and hard of hearing people. And also it can be very tiring to stare at a screen or to see that person, smaller than they are in real life. And imagine if all of us depending on Zoom all day, it can just really be exhausting visually, especially for deaf and hard of hearing people. So it's important for us to think about what we can do to minimize those barriers. And one example would be just to ask the person, so what would be the best way for me to communicate with you? Just ask them, what are their preferences? Or just try to think about what it would be like for them. Oh, Jada, did you have a comment?
Yeah, this is Jada. I would like to add, we really want to empower them instead of making decisions for them. So really giving that giving that power back to that person.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Because people don't know what they don't know. And allowing them to ask questions and empower themselves. Yes, I absolutely agree. Next slide, please. So I wanted to share some myths and facts. There's a lot of misinformation out there. Jada and I were talking yesterday about one time we went to the airport and people would say, oh, you're deaf. Do you need a wheelchair? No, I don't need a wheelchair. Jada, do you have some fun examples? Did you want to share?
This is Jada. I totally agree. I went to the airport. They asked me for a wheelchair, and it seems like a common question. And it's like, what kind of training are you getting? But the other thing that we had talked about is a common question is, do deaf people drive? And it's like, yeah, I just can't hear. I can see just fine. That doesn't impair me at all. So it's just those interesting questions that we get asked.
Right, absolutely. Another myth that I see very often is sign language universal? And the answer is no. Every country, every group of people have their own sign language. American Sign Language has a lot of influences from French Sign Language. But other countries like, for example, have their own sign language. And another myth that I also see is that, oh, you're deaf, that means you know Braille. That untrue. No. People who are deaf blind might learn Braille, and Braille itself is challenging to learn, but no, deaf people don't all read Braille. Next, with lip reading, I see another myth commonly with lip reading. Can every deaf person lip reading? And I would say it depends. I don't want to say yes, because lip reading as a skill is hard to learn. Only 30% of English words are really visible and obvious if you're lip reading on the mouth. And there's so many factors that contribute to if you're going to have a good lip reading session, such as, is the lighting well? Am I well rested? Am I, So a lot of factors to if lip reading is possible, but really only 30% of English words are really visible on the mouth.
This is Jada. Yeah. Yeah, I would like to add that with lip reading, right, like you said, it's a common question. Do all deaf people lip read? And I would say the answer is no. So again, we have to be really careful that we don't make assumptions. We meet one deaf person who's a really good lip reader, but we can't assume that all deaf people are the same. So instead of lip reading, always making sure we have backup options to communicate, writing back and forth, using our phones to text back and forth, and just recognizing that every person is an individual.
Absolutely. This is Elise here, and I just want to emphasize and just clarify, ask the person, what do you prefer? Do you prefer to lip read? All right. No, they said it. That's fine. But just ask how would be best to communicate with you. And secondly, do you think if you speak louder to a deaf person, will that help? No, it won't. So you don't need to raise your volume when trying to communicate with a deaf person if it's through lip reading.
Exactly.
And again, I can't emphasize enough, just ask the person, what would be best for you to communicate? I mean, this being a person-centered philosophy in our field, just ask. And I'm seeing a question, are people becoming deaf or hard of hearing later in life? And yes, the answer, yes. You know, there are people who are born deaf and their hearing loss can get worse over time as well. Or as well, people can have hearing loss later in life. Or sometimes it can change throughout life. It can fluctuate. So people need to adjust. And also environments make a difference. Working in a quiet office compared to working in a loud warehouse. You know, that background noise, even with the hearing loss, can be distracting compared to a quiet office. So, and also having windows within an office, because that light can be distracting to a deaf person as it kind of shines in their eyes or whatnot. Okay, and if we could do the next slide. So this is a short video I'd like to show. And in the video, there's a white woman and with strawberry blonde hair and freckles and blue eyes. And she's just one of many. There's a lot of people in the video. So I'll go ahead and show this and enjoy. So Anne, anytime you're
When
ready.
I was really young, probably kindergarten or first grade, I have a much older brother, and we'd go out to recess, and there was this older guy, he might have been in like 5th or 6th grade, that always used to pick on us, and I didn't really know what to do about it, and I definitely looked up and completely trusted what my brother did.
Today we went to a high school and I pet.
I was posing for a picture with all of my girlfriends when all of a sudden one of them reached over.
Can you read my lips?
Can you read
My lips.
Can you read?
Can you read my lips? Can you read her lips?
My dad Clementine loves bread. She stole a loaf off the counter.
Can you read her lips?
I have 2 dogs. One boxer, she's 7.5, and one mixed breed who's 8.
I am deaf, but my words. What the is a hearing one? I rely on the visual, not the auditory. The word lip reading implies reading, like reading a book
whose text is legible and clear.
But the human face isn't a book.
and the reading is reading.
And my favorite
People
part
mumble, people talk fast, they laugh loudly, people have facial hair like open eyes, lips like sphincters, people cover their mouths, people have accents. But real conversations don't take place in a studio.
Growing up, I used to.
I'm putting together a puzzle without all the pieces. I look in on your mouth. I try to grasp with one sense information intended to another. There have been times when I've questioned why I even tried to read the way through the swamp, when I could just use sign language. Some deaf people choose to do just that. It's like a different world. A world filled with rich expression and culture. When people sound, they come alive. But I know I want both worlds. Communication is never a given.
Tuesday, I woke up, had a rash.
She just pulled my dress down and
When I was little,
Wow.
my family got a cat.
Like, why don't you
morning.
just hit him in the
I
face?
helped
That was like the last thing that I ever
guinea
would have done.
pig.
Winter, I learned
and two different kinds of
I only cried twice.
But when the reading works, when I focus on one natural face and launch into a conversation, something clicks. Right then, I feel something extraordinary. Human
Connection.
So this is Elise. So I'm curious, any reactions or comments to the video? Please go ahead and share those in the chat.
This is Jada, none yet. Yeah, it's a very powerful video. This is Jada. So I would say, again, thank you so much for sharing this powerful video. Yeah, it was really eye-opening. Tara says all of the noises were overwhelming. Mhm. So this is Jada. I would like to just suggest for the people who have just watched the video, in your free time or whenever you can, it's really fun to try muting videos to see if you can actually lip read those videos and kind of feel what it's like in those shoes. You know, what does that pressure feel like? So kind of a fun exercise. Someone is mentioning in the chat that they have tinnitus, and when the ringing happened and basically drowned out that noise, it's pretty much what happens when I'm in a super loud environment. That was the best video that I can show to others. Yeah, we appreciate that, Michael. Thank you so much. Other people are saying, yeah, it makes perfect sense. One person says, now I understand what my husband goes through. Thank you. Very enlightening. Another individual is mentioning that they have tinnitus as well, and that they can also become dizzy from that tinnitus. Michael is emphatically agreeing. Yes. So this is Jada. I have a story that I can share.
Please,
Okay.
go ahead.
Yeah, so just one experience that I had working in VR. And way before COVID, I was in a meeting with many of the other counselors. We were having a potluck, and I'm very much an observer, so I sit back and typically just watch the conversation. Some of the counselors forget to sign. They use American Sign Language, but it's normal to fall into your first language. So I decided to go warm up my food, and they were still talking about food. I decided it was a good time to leave, go get my food warmed up, etc. One of my coworkers came into the room and said, "Hey, how do you say hamburger?" And they said it to me. So I showed them the sign for hamburger. One of my coworkers came in and signed. They were trying to sign her name, Amber, not hamburger. And I had showed her the sign for hamburger. So luckily, I mean, that's one instance of when lip reading can be a huge misunderstanding. They had changed topics. I thought they were still talking about food. So I used the context I had and thought they were still talking about hamburgers. So, it's interesting that that misunderstanding happens because they had already changed topics, right? I didn't have any of that context. I mean, I felt so horrible. Amber, not hamburger, but that's just one example of how that happens.
Yes, this is Elise. That's a great example of just not knowing the conversation has moved on and how lip reading can just be so so wrong sometimes. I know there's two words, the word 15 and 50, two numbers, 15 and 50, that are incredibly confusing. They look exactly the same on the mouth. So that's something that can really throw you off. And it's a big difference. That's a huge range between 15 and 50. You wouldn't want to mess that up. And I just think about our clients who are looking for work and how we are looking for employment, how we can support them. And one way we can support them is to have clear communication available to them. We have two of our staff do presentations on what they call clear speech. And that presentation, clear speech, it's kind of gets into the philosophy. Like if you say something that the person doesn't understand, then just try to find another way to say it rather than repeating it. Just brainstorm another way to say it. Because it might be kind of useless to just repeat yourself trying to communicate the same way, but just try to think of another way to do that. And there's technology that is available. I believe we have some listed in the resources, some speech technology. And if you Google it, you can find a lot of resources out there. And technology is getting better and better. That's speech technology. Mary Beth and Chris, who are on our team, are really, really, really good at explaining technology options that are out there that we can offer to participants to enable them with communication. I'd also like to add that online you can also find hearing loss simulations. There's videos that can show kind of what it's like or what it feels like to communicate with the hearing loss. There's many websites. You can find them through Bing or Google. Just put in hearing loss simulator, just to give you an idea. It can show you what it really can feel like, what it can sound like for a person with a hearing loss. And also different hearing loss levels too, mild to profound, whatnot. Let's see, next. Well, I think the video is powerful, and I wanted to show that to you because I think it can help you get an understanding of the challenges with lip reading. Next slide, please. So for those of you working with students with a hearing loss, I just wanted to share some factors to consider. Now there is early screening and intervention because language development, almost starts right away. Between ages 0 and 3, the first 3 years of life, it's just crucial that babies have the ability to develop language. And if a child is identified later, like at age 3, there could be a little bit of a lag with language. So early screening and intervention is just crucial. The age of diagnosis, pre versus post-lingual, makes a huge difference. after the age of 3, it's harder to kind of acquire language. So the earlier that we can identify children with hearing loss, the sooner we can keep them up to speed with acquiring language. So again, that's why that early screening and intervention is just so crucial, to be able to identify right away if this child does have a hearing loss, and then expose them to communication as soon as possible. It's also too important to think about the level of family involvement, the family's culture, the language that they use in the home, and make sure that that is also exposed to the child as well, because when a child doesn't have language, they're language deprived, and that can just have so many detrimental effects later on. So knowing how the family communicates at home, and also knowing how the student feels about communicating with their family members, their parents, their uncles, their aunts, cousins, whatnot. Just knowing more about how involved is this family in this particular child will help us be able to predict, outcomes. Self-advocacy and determination skills. Just learning, what does that student know about advocacy? Do they know how to ask for what they need? For example, an accommodation, an interpreter. Do they know how to ask, when to ask, how to determine what situation needs an accommodation? I mean, during the high school years, it's just critical that these students are able to learn these sort of self-advocacy and determination skills for their future. Next, the presence of additional disabilities. And again, it depends, what disability is primary, secondary, furthermore, and learning what those are can help us get a better idea of the impact that it has on that person. So if a person has hearing loss, it can make a huge difference if they have tinnitus, or if they have other issues associated with their hearing, like vertigo. Like for example, for myself, when it's nighttime, I notice I'm a little unbalanced. I think it's just hard, and it's harder to see at night as well. So that has an influence on me. So just knowing that about our students too. And also learning more about their hearing loss. People assume, well, if you have hearing loss, you can't hear anything, but that's not necessarily true at all. I'm very sensitive to loud shrieking noises. Like, I have 2 dogs, and when they bark, it's loud, and it really catches my attention, and it can be painful almost. And there's other diagnoses to consider as well, like those with Usher syndrome. They may be born with a hearing loss and then later on lose vision. So it's a dual sensory loss of hearing and vision. Just being aware of people's diagnosis is just so important. And the severity can really vary depending on the person. But Usher syndrome, what we see tends to be, folks with Usher syndrome typically are referred to State Services for the Blind for services. But again, it depends on the person. We may be serving folks with Usher syndrome as well. It could be to a point where their vision is stable and, adequate. And if it gets worse, they might be referred over to State Services for the Blind, or vice versa. So hearing loss, there's just a lot of things to consider when serving a person with hearing loss. I'd also like to mention different kinds of hearing losses. So we have sensory hearing loss, which can be due to nerve damage. We have conductive hearing loss, which is actually the bones within the ear are not functioning correctly, or it could be a combination of both. So like, for example, for myself, I have a sensory neural hearing loss. And actually my parents aren't 100% sure, because my hearing loss was identified when I was 2 years old. And at that time, the doctor thought it was nerve damage that was causing the hearing loss and not bone damage. And as a result, um, that makes a difference for what sort of accommodation that would help. Jada, do you happen to know for yourself?
Yeah, yep, mine is sensory nerve.
Okay.
Yep,
That seems to be the most common, I see.
right, yeah, this is Jada, just reemphasizing, mine is sensory neural. So if I'm using my hearing aids at the time, I also notice I feel more vibrations as well. So it kind of tunes into other senses. Not sounds, I mean, I can tell there is a sound, something, but I can't identify what it is. So I can react to it, but I can't identify exactly what it is. There's more information on the next slide, but it really depends. I'll save the information for the next slide, but I'll talk more about my hearing loss in just a moment.
This is Elise. Great, sure. And to be honest, there's just a lot to consider within a hearing loss. 30 minutes is just not enough to really cover everything. So I'm hoping that this will just be a beginning, something to pique your interest, I hope. And independently, you'll kind of do more research. For the IEP and transition goals, there are other factors to consider. When we think about the teachers, a classroom teacher, it's important for us to consider and wonder, do they have enough adequate knowledge about hearing loss when they're drafting that IEP for that student? Or the transition skills teacher or the itinerant teacher that only sees that student once or twice a week. Sometimes the language on the IEP, the information can be very vague around this topic. So, and sometimes it's hard to get everyone on the same page about hearing loss with that particular student. So it's just important to consider, what can we do to provide services to this student to achieve their goals that we have? And I think it just really takes us just, thinking a lot about this topic, hearing loss, how it can affect those students, and to just do our own research and to just think about what we can do to support them best. I know that some school districts are, to be quite honest, not the great when providing services for deaf, hard of hearing services. They're small, they might not have enough staff. They might not have that expertise, readily available. And they might only have a handful of deaf or hard of hearing students too. And it might not be justifiable to hire a qualified staff to work with such a small number potentially. Next, I'd like to talk about cultural considerations when working with students, deaf and hard of hearing. No eye contact. Eye contact is important. We as a deaf and hard of hearing population just really value having eye contact. It's important to our culture. It's how we communicate. However, it's also important to consider people with hard of hearing loss or any other disability. We don't want to overprotect them. It's really hard. It can be hard to resist, and I understand that, but it's really important that we don't overprotect them, like keep them out of events, keep them out of school because of wanting to protect them. No, I'm a firm believer of just encouraging, parents and family to have their student just be involved as much as possible. Next slide, please. Okay, excellent. So I wanted to talk a little bit about audiograms. Perhaps some of you have already seen an audiogram before, or maybe not. I know that we've all had kind of training from a certified audiologist available to us to talk about audiograms and what those mean and the different degrees of hearing loss. And it's hard for me to kind of get in depth on this today, but an audiogram, what I would like to emphasize essentially is that no two people have an exact audiogram. I mean, hearing loss varies from person to person. Like, for example, like for myself, I'm in the severe to profound range of hearing loss. I have better hearing on my left side than on my right. And on my left, I'm in my left, I'm severe, and on my right, I'm on profound. I usually don't even bother to wear a hearing aid on my right side, but on my left, with that severe hearing loss, I do have more of a benefit when I wear any sort of assistive aid. And I can hear environmental sounds, and like I know that somebody is talking in the room, but what exactly they're saying, the words they are using, that I'm not able to access. And so how it impacts me, I mean, honestly, you know, I use hearing aids not very often. I've noticed sometimes if I'm wearing a hearing aid for a long amount of time, it can give me a headache. So sometimes I just prefer to not use them and use a closed captioning or read. But I did try hearing aids to use them more frequently when my son was 3, because I wanted to be able to hear his voice, you know, especially when he was in, you know, school performances or musicals. It was just fun to be able to just be there. And I mean, it wasn't perfect. It didn't give me what I thought I would get by using my hearing aids, but at least I was being able to try that. Jada, did you want to share some of your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. This is Jada. So my hearing loss is profound, severe to profound. And growing up, I had hearing aids and I relied on my hearing aids like my glasses. Like I had to have my hearing aids. And it helps me again for environmental sounds and cues. I can hear motorcycles, I can hear traffic. Sometimes I can hear if something drops. My TV is typically on pretty loud if I'm watching TV. What else? It's interesting because, so within my family, I know my mom's voice because I grew up with her, so I can respond when she calls my name. And I could tell it was her. And my hearing aid is better in my right ear than my left. So when my mom said Jada, I would turn and talk to her. I've got a nephew who's 3 years younger than me, who has a really deep voice. And if we're one-to-one face-to-face, I can hear him. Most other individuals, I can't recognize their voice, or I can't tell who's talking or what they're saying. But if I'm face-to-face, it's easier. And I also use lip reading and what I can pick up with my hearing aid. So that helped me a lot. But again, I'm obviously more comfortable with my family. My friends I'm okay with, and other people's families, I typically would not rely on my hearing because it's a lot of work. What else do I want to add to that? Yeah, I do have hearing children that I can hear a little bit. Mostly I can hear their laughter. I love hearing their laughter. It makes me happy. And there are some other sounds that I can recognize, but that's typically what my experience is like.
Thanks, Jada. Thank you for sharing. And again, just want to emphasize, no two people are exactly the same. So again, it's good to ask if you're working with a person who has hearing loss, what exactly is their communication preferences? And I mean, potentially our transition age students might not be able to go into detail exactly, but it's worth asking. And one service that we do offer within our team is that consulting if needed. Like, for example, if somebody has a mild decibel hearing loss, they might be able to hear talking. If it's a moderate hearing loss, and I'm trying to remember what it was. I think you can hear the vacuum maybe, and maybe somebody crying, but it's muffled, it's not clear. If it's a mild hearing loss, that person might be able to hear a dog barking. A severe hearing loss, they might be able to hear a piano. And if it's a profound hearing loss, it's might be able to hear a truck, something very loud. And I mean, for me, usually I can feel the vibrations of a loud truck or a motorcycle that's nearby. Just some examples of what those hearing loss may look like. Next slide, please.
Yeah, this is Jada. I'm curious. One example, one famous example is water that's dripping out of the faucet. I don't notice that sound, but my kids will have to tell me, like, I can't hear the water running. So sometimes I'll leave the kitchen and the water's still running. And, you know, it
Right.
totally has happened that the water's flooded in my house and it's like, you know, whoops, who knew?
Absolutely. Same if the toilet's running. So if the toilet's
Oh,
running, I
yeah.
remember one time, you know, I didn't hear, the I didn't know that it was running, and it had been running for a while until I got the water bill. So yes, an excellent example to share of what that can be like. Yes. Now, actually, in my old car, it's one of those where it starts without a key. You just push a button, an on-off button. And sometimes I wouldn't realize that I've left it running. I mean, one time I left it running and I ran out of gas, and I had to had to ask my dad to come and give me a gas to fill me up because I didn't realize that it was still running. Now I have a car that does have a key again, so it's a lot better for me.
A
Well,
little more
because
reassuring.
right, you know, I wasn't hearing it if it was on or off. So
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is Jada. One story, it's one person is saying they love the personal stories. So thanks for that, Kelsey.
okay, next we'll move on to communication modes. Jada, just doing a time check. It's 2 o'clock now, so we have 30 minutes left. Maybe we should kind of pick up the pace a little so we can get through the rest of our slideshow.
Sure, no problem. Jada here. So when we think about different modes of communication, so again, when we meet a deaf, deafblind, or hard of hearing individual, there's a variety of communication modes that are used. So again, always defaulting to ask what is their preference. American Sign Language, some deafblind individuals use it and hard of hearing individuals use it. It's a visual language. Pidgin Signed English, which is using signs that are in exact English word order and showing like ing, I, to, you know, people would say, I am going to the store. As I've gotten older and use American Sign Language, you just say, I go to store, or you say, I go store. So just a difference in how those languages are used. Cued speech uses cues on the mouth for different syllables. And I honestly don't remember them, but it's really a lot on how the voice makes those sounds and what they look like on the mouth. Tactile sign language and protactile are using touch for deafblind individuals. Protactile is a communication mode. So if someone is using tactile sign language, so that's the content. Protactile is letting people know what's happening in the environment. People are watching you, people are laughing, someone walked into the room, so giving them those environmental cues as well. Oral and oral communication is all voice-based, sound-based, and you might meet individuals who know sign language or don't and just use oral communication. Communication boards are more of a way to show pictures, so definitely more visual in that type of expression. And there are several different categories of communication boards that are used. And finally, there's a combination of several modes of communication. So again, each individual has their own preferences and everyone uses their own communication modes in whatever way works best for them. So some individuals even change depending on the context they're in. Maybe they'll use American Sign Language or Pidgin Sign English, depending on the person they're interacting with in that moment. Elise, anything you want to add? Okay.
Oh, that was great.
Great. Next slide, please. So when we think about accommodations, again, they vary widely. So deaf, blind, and hard of hearing individuals typically know what they need as far as accommodations. You know, is there an interpreting agency? American Sign Language or ASLAS is one example of that. And if they offer both in-person and remote services, that's what we're using right now as we're working through ASLAS to contract with these interpreters today. Captioning services can also be on-site or virtual and remote. Video phones or captioned phones. Video phones are a device where a deaf person calls through an interpreting service. And so they can call to set up a doctor's appointment or chat with family. So all of that is done through an interpreter. There are captioned phones. One example of that would be CapTel. So they speak on the phone and there's an individual who captions the conversation and they read that on a screen. FM systems, we'll go into in a little more depth in the next slide. Texting and various apps are available. So speech to text or text to speech are other ways to communicate, like let's say in short-term situations like going to the store, or while we're in COVID, it's difficult to lip read or hear individuals with masks on. So some people might use that. Writing back and forth is an option, but we would like to caution you here. Not all deaf individuals, deaf, blind, and hard of hearing individuals are fluent in English. So they might write in what you would call broken English. So clear communication isn't always adequate here. There might be several misunderstandings, but again, we always try to meet people where they're at. Next slide, please. Oh, and Elise.
And these are just good tools.
So there are several different types of apps like Cardzilla. So you can type in the information before you go to the store. So it says like, I'm here to pick up my prescription and here's the name, and you can just show it to the individual. They're wearing masks, I'm wearing masks. So there are several apps that make that easier. And some people will say, oh, I can't read or I don't want to read. And so again, that's an example of the public not meeting us where we're at. So English might be a barrier for the person that we are communicating with. And in that case, we might gesture back and forth. Another option that I use a lot with my iPhone, and some of you might be familiar with it, but with the Notes app, I click on the microphone at the bottom and kind of hold it out for the other person to speak into. So they speak into the Notes app and the microphone will kind of transcribe what they're saying. And it's not exact and not super accurate. So another word of caution to everyone in the audience, that automatic speech recognition isn't perfect just yet. The tools are, obviously still in development, but, anything helps in a pinch, right? All right, and back to Jada. Next slide, please. Thank you, Elise. So we had mentioned this earlier, examples of assistive technology. So here you can see a few images of the FM system, hearing aids, cochlear implants, video phones, and the captioned phones. So that's just an example of what those look like. We would like to share as well that with Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services Division under the Department of Human Services, they do have an actual lab that if you want to go in person, or you're advocating for someone who wants to try out other assistive technologies, they have a place where you can go in person to try all of those different technologies and see what's the best fit for them. Next slide, please. Oh, Elise.
Yes, I would like to add. Another thing I would like to mention, if we don't have enough time, but I did want to briefly mention with technology, like obviously during COVID, Zoom has become a lifesaver for most of us. And a lot of people do like to use Zoom. I would say it's probably one of the best platforms out there. And I mean, MS Teams is another one. It's not the best, but it's okay. You can, with Zoom, you can easily add an interpreter or add captions. And what I've heard is that a lot of deaf folks like and prefer Zoom. And I know many schools are relying on other platforms and apps such as the Google apps and whatnot, and they do have live transcription services too that they are relying on. But I just wanted to throw that out there as a reminder that, again, asking our students, what they would prefer in terms of communication for a meeting or in the classroom is just imperative. I don't think we've got enough time for a break, unfortunately. Oh my goodness, we only have about 15 minutes left. Okay, I think we should keep rolling here. What do you think?
This is Jada. Yeah, I think we will keep steamrolling forward. We would like to respect everyone's time. I know it can be difficult to go without a break, but I think we'll just keep going forward. We have a lot of information to share.
Great.
So, do we want to do a short break? Does everyone feel okay about us like a 3-minute break? Or should we just go forward? Okay, keep going. Thank you, Mary Beth.
I'm seeing in
Appreciate
the chat
that, Michael.
going.
Okay,
Okay, so we've got the 15-minute home stretch here. So I'd like to turn this back over to Jada just to, so she can share some things to consider and options that we have available in Minnesota if you do find yourself working with a deaf and hard of hearing student. Because again, deaf and hard of hearing students, they go to schools all over the state and they have all their different structures and their systems and ways to navigate. So Jada, over to you.
great. Yep, Jada here. So again, when we think about all of the different schools that we serve and the different kinds of schools that we serve, there's Minnesota State Academy for the Deaf, which is a residential school. So the students go to classes all day and live in dorms on the campus. They might use transportation from home. Metro Deaf School in the Twin Cities is a day school. So students come to class all day and go home at the end of the day. They don't live in dorms on campus. There are a few teachers of transition students for deaf and hard of hearing students. Some schools have them assigned to stay within that campus, or they go to other schools throughout the program. There are some individuals or schools with deaf and hard of hearing teachers, depending on the school. Rural Minnesota might have less, and they might have to travel for that program depending on where they're at. One thing I would like to mention is there are a few schools that offer half-day classes, and in the afternoon, they might go to a mainstream program. So with the Minnesota State Academy for the Deaf, they might go to Faribault High School in the afternoon to take a variety of other classes. Or they might go to a work site position and might be gathering work experience during high school. So those experiences can look very different depending on where they're at. There are several transition programs as well, specifically usually for Deaf Plus individuals. There are specific classrooms designed for Deaf Plus individuals to be most effective, and obviously other students depending on what their needs are. Elise?
Yes. There's a very well-known program called Vector, and that's under District 287. It's from students from all over Minnesota who move to if they come to the Twin Cities, will take advantage of going to that Vector program at their transition program. And it's also tied to a community college, which allows those students to try community college and take classes. And it's an excellent opportunity for them to just kind of learn the college experience and learn how to handle those pressures that we all experience in college. MSAD Faribault also has a transition program as well. And Minneapolis and St. Paul collectively have their own transition programs too. And I think it's important for VR counselors to know all the options that are out there and to make sure that the IEP team knows that there are all of these transition programs that are available. Because I think there's a pressure from school districts to have our students graduate immediately. But for some students, just having more time to take advantage of some of those transition programs can allow them to build those skills and to also practice too, those self-advocacy skills that we talked about before, and also to get work experiences. Especially if they haven't had a lot of exposure to employment in the employment world. And in the rural communities, with resources and maybe expertise in the field being limited, those transition programs there can just be imperative. It can just give those students just more time to just be prepped and to learn and to have those experiences before they go off in their world. Okay, next slide, please. So what we have here are some questions to ask. If you're working with a school, ask, do they have a particular deaf and hard of hearing teacher on staff? Or is there an itinerant teacher, a deaf and hard of hearing teacher? If they have a deaf and hard of hearing teacher that's actually on site, it's imperative that that person is much more involved on the IEP team and in the team in general, since they know so much more about that student, seeing them so much. An itinerant teacher might have less contact with that student, but still worth to have them involved. And maybe ask, is there a VR counselor assigned to the student or a pre-ETS rep? This is just good information for us to know and gather. And again, checking in with the school, who they have on staff and what services they offer. Next slide, please. So when meeting with the students, again, always ask first, what are their communication preferences? Also worth it to ask, or imperative to ask, what sort of accommodations do they require? A sign language interpreter? Do they want to text back and forth? Do they want to write back and forth? Do they want to, just important to ask. And hopefully when fall comes around, we will be able to be meeting in person. And when that happens, it's important to consider the environment, environmental awareness, where the light is coming from. Is the lighting, is the person that the deaf and hard of hearing person is supposed to look at backlit, which can be problematic. And also in terms of lighting, sometimes students prefer a more dim light since they're so visual and rely on their eyes, and can just get exhausting to have a super bright light all the time. So again, just ask, what do you prefer in terms of the environment to make you most comfortable? And so since our students are more visual, maybe it would be better to just have visual aids while meeting with this student. And if you are providing video links, again, make sure that they are captioned. And also give the students time ahead of time to read the material first, just so that they are familiar with it. And instead of reading during the meeting, it can just kind of slow things down. So just having them have exposure to it first. And this next point I'd like to make can be true for really any student, hearing or deaf and hard of hearing. You'll get the answer, the I don't know. Then I call that the I don't know dilemma. So if you're finding that your student is getting a lot of I don't know responses, one way to combat that is just maybe to ask them, well, what experiences have you had with this? What barriers, or what do you think would help you get through this situation or through this barrier that is happening? And this can be in the school setting or the home setting, or maybe they're in a volunteer setting and they're experiencing some barriers. And when we ask them questions, they just don't know what to do. So just encouraging them to think about that and to just give them examples, different scenarios, or maybe just kind of paint the bigger picture for them to help them kind of work through that. Jada, was there anything you'd like to add? Okay, next slide, please. So for accommodations, the question always comes up, who pays, who funds the accommodations? And if it's happening during the school day, then the school district is responsible for accommodations and paying for those. If it's an after school or a summer program, then VR can pay for accommodations with pre-ETS funding or with our VR funding. Again, it just depends on the situation. We often cover the cost for accommodations, and we can use money that's that's promised in the state contracts that we have. If you're unclear, just ask your VR tech or someone on staff who's able to answer that question about those contracts, especially in the metro. So referring to CRPs, there are very few CRPs who I would say are qualified to serve our population. In the metro, we have just 2 or 3 programs that can provide services to students with hearing loss. I'd say in rural Minnesota, there's not a lot of availability or expertise working with this population. And usually we know that communication is so important to make sure that it's clear. And sometimes the option is to have an interpreter. Another option is having a certified deaf interpreter. Now, I know everybody knows Nick Zapko, who was kind of famous during the Governor Walz presentations as the sign language interpreter on screen. And Nick has been there through it all, through COVID and through the civil unrest that we've recently experienced. And that is something that we can provide as well. And we're always happy to answer any questions you have about accommodations, what would work, what wouldn't work, and whatnot. Next slide, please. And I will hand this back over to Jada for a quick review on how to refer deaf and hard of hearing students.
Sure, Jada here. So I've received several referrals from other pre-ETS reps, and I would just like to share what happens when you get a referral from a person with hearing loss. So it can be from a student, teacher, parent, whoever's involved. So describing those services and also making sure to describe what the deaf and hard of hearing team offers as well. So setting up that meeting to just go over what services look like. Depending on the student and family we're working with, if they need an interpreter, definitely hire an interpreter. We can also provide captioning if the state master contract or school district doesn't provide them. So if the school has an interpreter, again, we would always use the school resources first, but if they don't have an interpreter or captioning, we provide it. So as the student with hearing loss are identified, we would go through the intake. They might not have all of the documents needed, but feel free to transfer it to me in Workforce One if that's the case. So do the intake to the best of your ability. You would be listed as secondary staff, and then I would be listed as primary staff. And if that happens and when that happens, if we're doing a real referral, I'll walk you through that hand in hand. If there isn't any other need, I will take over and do intake with that student. Typically, as I talk with a student, I try to just get to know them. And through that conversation, they might naturally share information. And sometimes there's just a natural opportunity to add like, oh, did you know there are CART services? So sometimes when I'm sharing my background and my experiences, it's a good way to expose that student to the other options. And then that gives them an opportunity to really think about what would best be accommodations for them. So again, we always want to empower the student. So we take them through that CRP, but I typically have 3 common questions I ask. So are you comfortable working with the pre-ETS rep? Would you prefer to work with me? Would you prefer we work together? You know, there's so many ways we can collaborate to make sure we're doing it most effectively for the student. Next slide, please. So this is that common VRS flyer for pre-ETS services. The reason we're showing this today is because we typically show the flyer first and give the student time to read that over. They might not fully understand English, so it might require some elaboration on our part. So that's kind of an opportunity for us to feel out what services they might need, you know, and sometimes their peers might share that information. Sometimes they'll ask clarifying questions, which is another kind of cue for us. So next slide. Thank you, Anne. With pre-ETS services, I'm sure all of you are familiar with it. I'll just touch on this very briefly. For job exploration and counseling, we tend to use, I really like to just evaluate the student, what is their English proficiency? And we do kind of that interest inventory with them. Sometimes if their English proficiency isn't great, I will work by showing them images or miming what the types of jobs to help them evaluate what their interests are. For the work-based learning and experience, like we had shared before, with CVI and with Vector, there are several different online classes that can be taken. And what's nice about those opportunities is really it can be in the metro area or in greater Minnesota. Career Ventures Inc. Is the acronym for CVI. Sometimes they might see another deaf individual. So maybe there are only 1 or 2 deaf individuals at their school. So really having the opportunity to work with other deaf individuals outside of the classroom can be beneficial for that student. For deaf-blind individuals, again, many are visually based learners. So sometimes they really like to go to the work site and actually see what a day in the life of that person looks like. Is that kind of work a good fit for them? Maybe they don't know what it entails until they truly see it. So that's an opportunity we like to offer. And maybe if there are other deaf employees there, they have the opportunity to ask questions. So that deaf employee can kind of elaborate more on what that position looks like. And for some students, when we ask if they have work experience, they'll say none, but sometimes they'll say, I went to class for Feed My Starving Children. And so that's an opportunity for us to say, that's volunteer experience. So sometimes it depends on how we really phrase the question. So service learning is something that we really emphasize. Sometimes students, will say they don't know what they want to do. Maybe they're just getting ready to graduate high school. They feel they aren't sure whether they want to work or go to college, whether they want to go to a community college, 2-year, 4-year program. So we are definitely willing to explore all of those career options. Often, students in high school might go to college and it feels so different compared to their previous experience, because in high school, those teachers and parents were really actively involved, and college is so much more independent. So it's a good life lesson for some of those students to feel like, oh my gosh, I have to take care of all of these things on my own. So sometimes it's good exposure for them to tour, see the classroom, see what it's like to work with interpreters, and again, give that visual experience. What we would really like to emphasize is for workplace readiness, it's good to start with role playing. So some students, if there's like, what does this case look like? Sometimes really asking them questions, what is right and what is wrong? Like going with them through interviews. Communication and social skills is something we really work on to just be most appropriate for the workplace. Some of them might not even be familiar with how to fill out a job application or how to prepare a resume or job interview skills. So some students who apply they might not realize how important it is to put down their personal contact information. So really going through all the details, this is part-time, this is full-time. Sometimes we do practice applications and we really encourage those students to be very familiar with that. It's also important for students to know how to self-advocate. They really need to state how they need, what they need, how do they ask for interpreters, how do they advocate for themselves in meetings and interviews. So role playing is definitely a tool we use frequently to help those students learn how to self-advocate. We also have modules that students can watch, and I'll send those out. It's a series of videos that we've found to be really effective. Elise, anything to add?
Yes, I would like to add with those modules you were speaking about, self-advocacy for deaf and hard of hearing students are wonderful. And those are available for anyone to borrow. Also, I believe they're available online too. Give me just a moment here. So NCIC, it's the Deaf Self-Advocacy Organization. And I just wanted to share some resources, the Minnesota resource, the web resources, and ASL resources. These are the categories of resources I'd like to share. I feel like we might not have enough time for your questions, unfortunately, since we are running out of time. Actually, we're 3 minutes past. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for attending today. And again, we are available for any questions, consultation. Feel free to email either myself or Jada or anyone else on the team. The PowerPoint will be shared with you as well. And and in that PowerPoint, as you can see, we have many more web resources and resources here in Minnesota too, to share. So lastly, I guess I would just like you all to remember that if you're working with deaf and hard of hearing people, the best way to communicate them is to learn American Sign Language if you can. Here's our contact information. And again, thank you so much for the opportunity. Jada and I had a blast putting this together for you all, so thank you so much.
This is Jada. Thank you so much. We really appreciate everyone who attended today's training.
All right, a big, big thank you to Jada and to Elise for presenting today. A lot of great information, a lot of things to think about. And I agree, the personal stories were such a nice fit for being able to understand it all. So I really appreciate you sharing all of that. I don't know, I saw a camera come on, but I don't know if anybody had a specific question. What I'd like to do, I'm going to stop sharing for a second. I'll get out of this. I'll put in the link to the evaluation for people to provide some feedback today. Obviously, with all the information Jada and Elise have, I'm sure there's a lot more we could keep doing with training. And so it's always great to have everybody's feedback. So, so I'm going to plug this in. We'll send this out, as Elise said, with both the PowerPoint, and we're recording this training too. But we'd love to have some of your feedback as well. So thank you so much, everybody. And I think that's it. Unless anybody has any specific one question, we could probably answer just one. But. All right. Looks like we're getting a lot of great presentations and thank yous. This is fabulous.
This is Elise, thank you. And Jada, thank you. And thank you to our interpreters as well, Nina and Megan.
Yes, big thank you to the interpreters as well. All right, well, thanks everybody. Have a great, great day.